Right, as I said in the last video, I'm going to try and break down some of the concepts that I introduced in the last 2 videos, which was the pillar of creation. I'll put a little card up there again. This video, we're going to be going quantum. So don't worry if you're not too familiar with the term quantum, because the way that I'm going to use the concept is only really to help with the perception of space-time into time-space. The way that I differentiate the two is that time-space is where the perception is very much in that timely realm where we are, this material sector. And then this space-time is more so the perception from the cosmic sector into the material sector. So the last video when we went subatomic and I was explaining about the no self being that state of measure that the external is being measured into. And again, everything is paradoxal. So the no self isn't necessarily that a void of self, it's just that the perception of self is shifted into more so of the space-time element. So the intention of this video is to use that quantum concept to expand what your consciousness is aware of from that perception of time-space into the perspective of space-time. So the space-time is the concept that is embodying both time-space and space-time, but in a much broader perspective because you're focusing more so on that spatial element. So this diagram here, you can think of the embodiment of space-time, which also includes that time-space. As we move through this video, it will become a bit clearer as to what I mean by those. So here now I've got that map of self-realisation from Bentinho Massaro on this chalkboard. And Bentinho Massaro has got a brilliant video in his empowerment series. It's Empowerment 1.7, entitled The Origin Story of Creation, which is perfect for describing this section here. So I'm going to draw a little bit from that to help explain how all of this connects. And then this is where we go quantum, and again taking that kind of gateway process. I've included the different steps or the different gateways into that spectrum of totality, or the one infinite absolute. And I've also paired it with the double slit experiment because you know that's my favourite. And then this little diagram here is actually taken from a recent crop circle, which included a tree in its formation, which was very strange. And I'll be using it to introduce that 5th element, which we can think of as the ether. And if you're familiar with Nikola Tesla, then the ether is one of the concepts that he really took an interest in, and anything Nikola Tesla looks into is worth looking into. So I'm actually going to be going over these 2 diagrams simultaneously, and I'm going to kind of layer them on top of each other, and I'm also going to use them as a gateway into that seeming 4th dimension, or the 4th density, which you can kind of think of as an entrance into the quantum realm. So when you're living from that I am this state, that's the, if you remember from the last video, the very individualized sense of self. And that individualized sense of self is reinforcing its sense of self from that external data stream. So this is what I have here. So I've kind of gone Matrix in this because The Matrix is a great film to comprehend these very spiritual concepts in that kind of digital metaphor. And because that's such a powerful metaphor, the mind can sometimes get confused and mask over very similar concepts that it can comprehend for that spiritual realm that is uncomprehendable. So just to warn you about that. And I say that because I'm going to use the Matrix to explain a little bit. So if you remember from that last video, the magic trick being the 2 things that are happening simultaneously in the one moment. And that is, for instance, in this case, the physical and then the non-physical, embodying that one form, this paradoxal nature of the manifest and the unmanifest. So everything that is made manifest is made out of that material that is giving it a physical form to embody. But what's embodying it isn't physical. Just as, for instance, the mind can't be found inside the physical brain. When we're living in that separation of the understanding of how that magic trick plays out, then we're in that mentality of being hypnotized by the magician and believing that there's one thing going on at one time. So we can think of that as being the individualized self. So when the egoic structure is operating unconsciously, then its thought streams are being pulled in from that perception to create a perspective from. And that perspective that it's creating unconsciously is feeding that sense of self because it doesn't have the measure into that no self, because it's believing the magician about that magic trick that is based off that emotional gratification from the perception through those senses. And this way of living can cause a lot of suffering because it constantly needs that replenishing from that external to fill that empty state of the no self, because it doesn't understand what it is. So it can only temporarily mask over that spatial dimension that's being perceived as emptiness or loneliness or lack mentality. And then when your consciousness begins to awaken to that, then you're becoming conscious to those patterns that keep cycling through your external reality to be seen by your conscious mind, to make it aware that it's been operating from the unconscious mind, which is a very unique process that happens to each individual, and that information is sent from the subconscious mind. So the first gateway here is the self, that recognition of what it is to be a self as an individualized still point within that sea of motion. It's consciousness that's helping guide you through that, and your physical form is inside of your energetic bodies. So the depiction of this here is to kind of represent that. So remember how we've just said that the mind isn't located inside the physical brain. This is kind of like that. So the consciousness is projecting itself into your physical form from that kind of body of consciousness that surrounds your physical form, and none of it is separate, it all channels through. And you can see this here. So this is where that individualized self, or that sense of self, begins to receive guidance from that energetic system. So the manifest self now. Pure light is the manifestation of that field of unconditional love that you can kind of think of as being that presence energy. The underlying element of that material is unconditional love because it's undifferentiated in its original form. Gateway 2 is that unconditional love, or that field of potentiality. So unconditional love, just like the mind, is invisible. So these two very important states for your physical body to operate with are unknown to the eyes of that physical form that is perceiving that external reality. So it's very subtle in its nature, and therefore it needs light to illuminate that unconditional field of potentiality. So just like in the double slit experiment, you have that interference pattern. From the awareness of that interference pattern, you're entering into the intelligence of that free agency, or the unmanifest self. And that's where you're going from that kind of double slit experiment on light into the quantum slit experiment, or the observation of the intelligence or the awareness that those subatomic particles, the protons, neutrons and electrons, that are all like in a divine dance of orbiting this space around that nucleus, just like the planets orbit around the sun. And it's like the illumination of that external light, when you go subatomic, becomes the illumination of the light inside your being. And think of that as being pure intelligence. So the reason awareness is the unmanifest self is because the intelligence of awareness is aware of the fact that it's aware. So although it's formless, it's still aware of the intelligence of the operation that it's running. The free agency of awareness, think of as being that actionable principle, and the operation it's running is LoveLight. Conscious presence energy is allowing the intelligence of that free agency to penetrate into that field for everything that could potentially be to be made manifest. And when you think about it logically, it makes a lot of sense that way, because that intelligence of awareness is allowing infinite possibilities to play out. It's the presence of the unconditional love that allows that intelligence to play out in its infinite potentiality. When you're seeing in unity, all becomes that kind of self-experiencing, because the unmanifest self goes beyond that manifest self, and it all kind of becomes that infinite intelligence, the operation that awareness is running, beginning to see in unity or see others as oneself, pineal gland to pineal gland. So here I've put gateway 3 as being that unity. So unity is being kind of the reflection of this side, and then the two physical eyes being these two slits. So because it's all subatomic and it's all happening through the energetic systems that your physical form is inside of, it's kind of like your physical form unravels and it all channels back as an energy source now to be embodied. That's awakened from that manifest self, or the illusion of that external data stream being reality, and kind of awakening from the experiential into the experiencing, the changeless nature or the permanence that remains, bringing that into the experience, the awareness of unity being what you're now seeing through, and the two slits here being the physical eyes that are kind of beginning to see through that system in a different light, the illumination that's now illuminating that external experience. Think of infinity as being the absolute one, that beyond eye state, beyond experience. But the intelligence of its free agency sends data into that awareness state, and think of that as being pure intelligence. So the other side of that now, you can think of as being that quantum wave function collapse point, and it goes back to the particle nature of it. You can't ever really fully understand infinity, it just kind of gives you guidance points. So that becomes what you're kind of moving through to expand and contract with still in this one moment. And I've got these little electrons being shot out of this singularity point. So I've got gateway 1, 2, 3 and 4 here. So the 1, 2, 3 and 4, making up that kind of circle or that completion. And then you have the 5 or the 5th element being the ether that channels it all through back to this physical one moment. I don't know if you can see it, but I've kind of drew it as like a little vortex or the same portal point as the infinity. So the ether is really the magic of that material, carrying that intelligence through to this now moment. So always remember that very paradoxical nature. So I've got a very physical representation here that I've tried to draw to help with the perception of this, hopefully for a bit more comprehension. So you can think of these, above this line being the perception from space or space-time. This below point being that system of time or the time-space. This is like that paradoxical line of it being one thing or the now moment that leads back to the one absolute or infinity, that singularity point. And then these little bits being that soul seed, that energetic umbilical cord that ties you back to the one absolute. So as you can see here, this first depiction is kind of in self-realisation of that, where it ebbs and flows between itself to become that kind of waveform of light on the external that's illuminated by that internal light. And then here we have that kind of self in separation mentality that's being highlighted by the subconscious mind as needing help or needing guidance or assistance. You can see from that space-time, it looks like it's very above that line, like calling out, like hand up in class and it needs help. The law of one says a really good point. When you ask for help, that's when the higher vibrational kind of service to others comes in and helps you. But when you're kind of shadow boxing in the corner with your own shadows, in that victim or that lack mentality, then the higher vibrational beings for service to others in that time-space sector won't necessarily approach you unless you ask for that help. So for instance, as soon as you take a break from shadow boxing and you get a drink and you ask like what time is it to them, they can swoop in and be like, are you alright, you've been at that for a while. And then they'll start showing you all these different things that you've been kind of sat on or you've conditioned yourself to believe. And then it's up to you to perceive that how you want to perceive it for growth or to move further into this lack mentality. So really quickly, this lack mentality, as you can see here, that kind of shadow boxing, your perception is on that shadow and you're missing the light that's kind of shining on you or waiting for you to turn around to recognise it. And you can think of this slide here as being the ether, and that lack mentality that you're holding inside that spatial dimension or that temporal dimension translates into the very victim experience within that system that's experienced as time, that's allowing them patterns to be received by your conscious mind. And as you can see, this soul seed has sunken down from that lack mentality into that victim experience. It's feeling that self-made resistance from allowing that shadow to surface as a victim experience for its perception to operate within, and no internal light can reach it. So it's always good to be flexible and buoyant with these belief systems so that you can allow light to filter through to you that can change the perception and in turn the perspective that you're operating in. So I hope I was able to shine some light on these concepts, and I'll be revisiting similar concepts in the next video. So thank you so much for watching and for your time, and I'll see you soon.